This week, a look at how some of EC Comics' famous stories about prejudice look to the modern academic reader, as Kumar and Emmet discuss the book EC Comics, Race, Shock, and Social Protest by Qiana Whitted. First, if you appreciate the work we do on Deconstructing Comics and our other podcasts, we'd love it if you'd support the show at patreon.com/deconcomics for as little as $2 a month. Check out our goals and rewards and pledge your support now at patreon.com/deconcomics.
This is Kumar.
This is Emmet.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Kumar out just outside of Melbourne, Emmet way outside of Melbourne. We are going to discuss another academic book this week, the second one in a row for the two of us. This time it is EC Comics, Race, Shock, and Social Protest by Qiana Whitted. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. She's a professor at University of South Carolina, I believe. And this came out in 2019. I read it for pleasure. I really I waited. It took me it took me about 2 years to buy a copy because it's an academic text. The price was very high. It was hard to kind of find a reasonable price copy. Finally, I bit the bullet and did buy it last year and read it. Before we really get into it, I actually did contact her and ask her if she wanted to do an interview. Mm-hmm. She just said she was just plain too busy to do it. But the shock of it was that she said she has sometimes listened to the show on the car ride to work. And whenever this happens on the show, it is mind-blowing to me because we only have about 50 listeners. So when somebody that we've talked about, like Durf or someone, says, "Hey, I listened to the show," it's really mind-blowing to me. On
that note,
yeah,
I feel I should also mention, given that you alluded to the previous academic work that we talked about recently, the other 1980s, Qiana actually gives a thank you to Brandon Costello and Brian Cremens.
Oh, right, yes.
In the preface.
Yeah.
And we've had Brian Cremens on twice this podcast. And also we've had Jonathan W. Gray on the podcast, and he's also thanked here.
Right.
So a couple of alma mater are in there. Maybe that's why she listened to episodes with her mates.
Maybe, yeah. I don't know. She just said she's listened to a few episodes or whatever, and it was kind of like, holy moly. Okay, but anyway.
That's nice.
Yeah, it was nice. So I'm not sure quite where to start with this book, but it is exactly what the title is, Race, Shock, and Social Protest. It's kind of an analysis of how EC Comics approached a lot of what were called the preachies, jokingly called the preachies, almost self-deprecatingly, by Al Feldstein, who wrote most of these stories discussed here with Bill Gaines. And I love EC Comics. And I actually started on the Gold Key horror comics, like the Ripley's Believe It or Not and Boris Karloff. And then I learned, that was when I was really little, and then I kind of learned that actually there's these better comics called EC Comics, and those are the ones you should be reading. And I started getting into those, and I was really amazed by them. And then when I could afford them, I bought a bunch of the Russ Cochran reprints from the early 90s. Now, the ones I bought were Shock Suspense Stories, Vault of Horror. So I have like all of those, and all of Frontline Combat, which I covered with Tim on the show many, many years ago. Now, a lot of the stories she talks about in this book are in Shock Suspense Stories, which I didn't realize, even though I had read every issue of it, there was a pattern to the organization of the 4 stories that were in each issue, in which I think the third story was, like every single issue, the third story or the second story or whatever would be what Feldstein called these preachy comics, which were these comics that were like message comics, which had I don't know, I read this 200-page book. I'm still not sure quite what the word is to describe them, but they were trying to be socially conscious.
Yes, and at the time they had a term for it as well. They used to refer to them as the new relevant or the new trend.
Well, new trend was the whole line. The entire, yeah. So I guess it was definitely a part of the new trend line. I don't think they were doing anything like that before.
There's a quote from Feldstein where he's talking about, I guess this is what you would call relevance now. This idea of being socially, politically relevant.
Woke comics.
If you like. And again, these are comics from the 1950s.
Yeah.
And a large part of the story does relate to the 1954 U.S. Capitol Senate subcommittee investigation into crime and horror comics and how Bill Gaines fared. And I think we've touched on this a couple of times in the past, and certainly the events have been parlayed, and I've seen through a couple of different ways, that Bill Gaines spectacularly left the side down, and other people say, no, actually, he was very astute, and then,
apparently he was on all sorts of meds when he went in.
He looked nervous, he was sweaty.
Yeah.
So it didn't come across well. But, the reason I'm bringing that up is because, yes, you lobbed the word woke into the proceedings, so let's address that. One of the main issues with that line of inquiry, if you like, is there's this delusion that in the very recent past, a fad of social consciousness, social justice, I believe they refer to it as, has entered the comic sphere. Right. Whereas what Whitted is making clear here is, well, these preachy stories, and the preachy is a humorous way of the writers and creators poking fun at the stories they were telling, were ahead of the curve as far as comics are concerned in terms of, well, let's actually talk about these issues. Let's discuss what's going on in America right now. Right. And maybe, we talked before we started recording whether or not we're going to mention recent events, but this is potentially an entry point for that. Maybe the issue, the Senate inquiry, wasn't so much the horror and the violence. Maybe the issue was the fact that they were raising these concerns around race and racism and anti-Semitism, and maybe that's what needed to be stamped out.
That's an excellent point, because there was one of the stories which I can't remember exactly which one it was. I think it was the whipping. What's the name? I can't believe I'm blanking. Who's the guy that tried to shut down comics? The psychiatrist that said the kids. Wortham. So Wortham was holding this up as an example of like a super racist comic, and it's exactly the opposite of that, right? So it's almost exactly what's happening with Mouse this week. So I mean, the other thing is, coming into this book, I was really a bit nervous because she talks a lot about this article that came out about 10 years ago by Swat Tong Ing, which really tore the EC Comics a new asshole, saying that they were really shitty, basically. Like he described it as they were intellectually lazy. And I was really worried that after that there was been a little bit of a, I don't know if I've read anything else exactly, but I feel like there's been a shift to, these are ham-fisted and didactic, and I think she mentions that it's possible. She quotes someone as saying it's possible to overstate the exceptionality of the preachies, and there's a myth of quality attached to Easy Comics. I think that's a Bart Beatty quote. So I was really kind of worried coming into this book that it was going to take a really negative look. I think that because the analysis of the book is it was trying to approach these issues, but was it successful at them or not? And what I love about the books, I found it's really level-headed, balanced. She says, this stuff works, this stuff doesn't work. And sometimes they're oblivious, which is often the case with accidental racism, is they're oblivious to the messages there. That they're trying to put out a positive message, but sometimes they don't realize what's actually happening under the surface. Like the fact that, so for example, like a story like Blood Brothers. So there's this guy who hates black people so much, And when he finds out, I think his neighbor is black but passes, quote unquote, passes for white or looks white or whatever that means. He's like, he hounds him until the guy kills himself. And then he finds out from a doctor that once when he was a kid, he got a blood transfusion that saved his life. And that blood transfusion came from a black kid. And as Whitted points out, basically, he doesn't go to jail or anything for...
No, there's no consequence for him.
There's no consequence, but the punishment is he becomes a black man. Right? But it's interesting because it's the same. There's an anti-Semitic story called Hate, and there's always a question because of Feldstein and Gaines, like, and there were so many Jewish writers involved, and it's like, would they have been any different? Would it have been different if they were black writers or whatever? But it's interesting because Hate is almost the same story, except it's about Jewishness, where this guy, they hound these Jewish people in the neighborhood until this couple dies. And then there's a twist, and it's revealed that he's actually Jewish and he was adopted. And again, there's no legal punishment against him. The punishment for him, even from the Jewish writers, is it turns out he's Jewish.
Yeah.
Right. So to me, I think the thing is, Feldstein and Gaines were writing sensationalist comics, and they had a mode of writing, and a constant point that comes up in the book is that the black characters don't have they never speak sometimes they don't have a single word of dialogue in these stories that are for them, ostensibly. But I think every victim in an EC comic almost never has a voice. Like, it's always about the villains and the comeuppance of the villains. So since they were still writing in that sensationalist mode, I feel like they were, I don't know, maybe intellectually lazy is the right word, because I don't know if they could necessarily go outside of that box, because often the examples that she pulls out of stories that aren't quite like that and do work better are written by Harvey Kurtzman or by Craig Steen taking over Master Race or something like that.
Yeah, and I think it does a disservice to just write EC comics off entirely as products of their time. You're looking at art history, you're looking at some excellent illustrators, you're looking at some excellent draftsmen at work here. I'd previously read a bunch of Jack Kamen, and his stuff gets mentioned here.
Yeah.
Wally Wood, obviously. Here's your one per episode. I have this association with Joe Orlando because of Watchmen.
Sure.
Because Moore makes the point of identifying Watchmen in his alternate reality as being this key figure in the inspiration for the big plot.
Yeah.
And there's a great bit that Whitted quotes where Orlando is joshing with Wally Wood that you can't actually draw a black man.
Yeah.
and look at this black man, but that does speak to your point in that there was a tendency in American comics not to actually visualize black people outside of caricature in any way that was identifiably black.
Yeah.
And so at the risk of not causing any offense, they were basically white characters who looked dark skinned.
Right.
And this is something that Tim and I have raised recently with the obvious recoloring of some characters in early Spider-Man issues, in his Spider-Man 1963 series.
Okay.
That's come up a few times, where it looks like somebody's just come in after the page has been finished and then just literally daubed dark colors over the face of a character.
Right.
Say, that's actually a black character.
Right.
So yeah, there is something there where they are looking to talk about these issues, but maybe they're not necessarily engaging as directly as they could with them and giving these people a voice. But certainly, I think some of the stories raised, I really like Ingratitude. Again, the point of the story isn't to hear from the black person is already dead at the start of the story.
Yeah.
But the reveal that they were black is this shock. And then the story ends on this note of, again, collective white shame.
Yeah.
The shame of a community. And I find that interesting. So there is an attempt to reckon with that. They're conscious of what they're doing, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So again, thinking about the Swat Tong Ing article and the whole of this book, I really don't know, at the end of it, do we feel that the EC Comics were making baby steps, or were they did they not go far enough? Could they have gone farther? It's really, hard for anybody. It's amazing. It just takes one generation to kind of forget this stuff. Like, I don't know what the state was. It's hard to gauge how radical they were or not radical they were.
We need to again address that, the Senate subcommittee buried this publisher.
Yes.
Right? Buried them. So, as much as I think there is some cultural amnesia at work here, there is also the sense that their competitors looked at them and went, all right, well, we won't do that then.
Right.
And there probably was this inbuilt conservatism across, timely national that was Marvel DC that became afterwards, okay, we won't touch any of those things. Or if we do touch them, very likely touch them, because EC Comics were successful.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it. The thing as well to bear in mind, and the author does an excellent job of this, when you go from Max Gaines to Bill Gaines, and educational comics becomes entertaining comics.
Yeah.
Or entertainment comics, sorry. They are trying to make a buck. They are, and I think what they proved, there was again a demand for these stories.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of the other 1980s, because one of the things we talked about in our discussion of that was, well, there's clearly a commercial interest in these kinds of stories that for some reason were strangled in the cot as far as the US comic industry is concerned in the 1980s. Like, there were, for some reason, these paths that the comic industry could have taken were not taken.
Right.
And, it's not a commercial imperative. The commercial interest is there.
Yeah.
So my suspicion is it's a cultural imperative. It's not so much that could EC have gone further. It's could Americans have gone further.
Right. Okay. So I guess that means that they were. Well, she quotes a lot of the letters pages about the stories, and that's really awesome because actually none of the reprints have those. Well, I think the current ones do, but Russ Cochran in the 90s had his own letter pages for the reprints that were coming out, not for the original letters. So that's kind of the main thermometer we're getting, and the debate that's happening in the letters pages about this is a really radical comic, or sometimes super racist people are writing in saying this is total crap.
Yeah, and again, you have that same idea that we've recently discussed, where you have people saying, Feldstein's shoving this stuff down my mouth.
Yes, yes.
So that tune doesn't change.
Yeah.
That's a constant thing.
Yeah, right.
Don't make me think about this.
Yeah.
In effect.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting. You're right. It's absolutely essential that she's included the letters. That gives you that does give you a gauge for what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
But even like in recent memory, I'm not even talking about message forms, but I still. The 2000s, you still had letters pages.
Right.
But I remember reading, I think it was Brian K. Vaughan on Runaways.
Okay.
And I'm not mentioning the artist because I think there was a switch already at the time, and I can't recall which artist was working on that storyline at the time, and I apologize to the creative team. But Runaways featured a young girl who is identified as queer.
Okay.
And then a self-identified father wrote a letter in, and it was basically like, I'm not going to, my child and I enjoyed reading it, but I'm not going to read this to my child anymore because you're exposing my child to these ideas. I'm not going to do that. So this, potentially he was more polite than the racist individual who wrote into EC, who's quoted in this book. But the resistance to engaging with the material is identical.
Right. Right, yes. Well, I guess instead of the forums, I mean, even today I saw an article that Florida was banning a bunch of books, not banning, but pulling from the shelves, the school shelves, like Arena Telgemeier and a bunch of others. And a lot of them, you could tell from the title when, I can't pull up the article now, but it was very clear that they were like about queer identity or stuff like that. But aimed at middle schoolers or whatever. Yeah,
Durf McDurf was on Twitter, and he mentioned that as much as the Mouse case has caught the attention of people because it's a Pulitzer winner, because it's about the Holocaust, he addressed that there is this nationwide campaign to pull genderqueer and memoir off shelves.
Yeah.
And I just want to say, for the record, Derf, you made a sale on the back of that. Thanks very much. I immediately went out and bought a copy. Because I believe that, I think there are the headline stories that get everyone's attention. I think that's important. This is the conversation we should be having. But then you need to take the next step. Okay, what else is out there that's getting attacked? Right. Let's protect those. And I'd love to reach out to the creator of that and see if they're available to talk to us potentially. I'd love to do that. So I'm going to pull up the name of that book in a second now. But I think that's an ongoing issue.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Maya Kobabe is the name of the author. Genderqueer and Memoir is the name of the book.
Okay.
Thanks again to Dirk for calling that out.
Yeah. So I feel like Gaines and Feldstein were trying to build a base of allies.
Okay.
If you know what I mean, and I'm trying to defend the EC comics, despite their flaws. That's my thing, because I'm holding on to my 12-year-old self's love of these comics, and even my 18-year-old self reading all, and just being at the time in 1990 reading these comics from 1952 and being shocked that they were that progressive, even if they were like I was oblivious to thinking about the fact that the black people didn't have voices until I read this book, and I was like, oh yeah, I should have noticed that, or I should have picked up on the fact that the only punishment is that the guy is black. That's his punishment for murdering someone. These things that if I'd had the brain power maybe, or if I'd been more analytical about it, but I can't help the feeling that I felt reading them, because you're either going to be offended by the twist, or you're going to be like, yes, this makes total sense. I love this, right?
Yeah. Well, let's address it from the point of view of Qiana Whitted's approach, which is, to single out stories like Blood Brothers, Hate, Ingratitude, Bernard Kriegsstein's Master Race, Judgment Day, which is the one I think, it's always synonymous with the Black Astronaut story. Sure. It's the one everyone remembers. Yeah. It's become almost shorthand because it was so wrapped up in the Comics Code censorship and the pettiness of that Irish Catholic gentleman.
Yeah, there's a really funny line. There's not much comedy in the book, but there's a very funny line where she talks about the conversation he had with Feldstein, where he talks about what he's not allowed to put in there.
Yes.
And I can't remember what the line is exactly that the censor says, but Whitted's line was, if only we had the Leroy lettering to know where the emphasis was on that sentence.
Yes. That's a good line. Yeah, you're right. And it is funny just revisiting these stories, and she includes segments from them in the book as well, and there's some nice sort of indications of her argument, particularly with Ingratitude, where you've got the idea of the sort of drained out color of the war scene, so we can't tell that there is a racial difference between the two characters in effect, because of the use of lighting and the use of color.
Yeah, Mary Severin gets name checked a couple of times in the book for that. Yeah,
her coloring choices.
Yeah.
But yeah, I am fascinated with the use of lettering because they're so pronounced. And then that becomes part of Gaines's defense on the stand, where he's saying, oh, well, as you mentioned before, how Wertham misinterpreted the comic, and Gaines is arguing, well, you haven't read the caption. The narrative voice is actually leading you through the story. Yeah. And, you're only reading the speech balloons. And I find that fascinating because looking at they're also, it's so solid. And I think we've grown up with softer dialogue balloons, speech balloons, thought balloons. It's more integrated into the panel. These are still sitting on it because they were literally being glued onto the page.
Yeah, and they were lettered first. So this is another really fascinating thing about it, is because you could almost read an EC comic quote-unquote comic without the artwork, because they lettered the whole thing, and the artwork was almost secondary. I mean, they had the best artists, and she does appreciate the art in it a lot, which I also liked, which was something I liked about it. But it's fascinating to me that the artwork is, in a sense, almost irrelevant, but it was the only thing that, well, almost the only thing that Wortham picked up on was like, look at the scene of this whipping or whatever. I mean, he did call out the use of racial epithets or whatever, which of course would have been lettered before the artwork was on there. But it's, yeah.
Yeah, but the tragedy of Wortham is, and look, we should mention as well, because the book came out a few years ago, but Whitted does make a point of shouting out Carol Tilley's book, Seducing the Innocent, Frederick Wortham, and the False Occasions That Helped Condemn Comics, which was kind of like the final word on Wortham, really. It's been treated as such by a lot of people. But the kind of the tragedy of Wortham for me is that I feel he and Max Gaines both arrived at the same point, which was that the comic book is a tremendous vehicle to convey information to children. Right? Very impressionable, but where Gaines saw, so Gaines the father, when he founded Education Comics, where he saw the capacity to disseminate information widely, having seen the success of the Donenfeld era with National, he saw that kids were gobbling up these stories that they were sending. So let's do Bible stories, let's do histories. He saw the educational capacity of comic books. Wortham sees a wolf whistle to fascism. Right. And it's tragic. Because I feel like they're two sides of the same coin almost. And then what I think is really good about this book is we then have that section where the journalist Robert Warshaw and his 11-year-old son enter the proceedings for, I think it's a magazine called Conversation. But that Warshaw is like responding to the subcommittee inquiry, and he writes this article. He says, well, my 11-year-old son loves these comics. He keeps reading these comics. I can recognize that they have artistic merit. I can recognize that there are stories here which are good, and my son assures me some are good to middling. Like there's a range. But he was concerned, the dad was concerned that his son was then potentially missing out on a wider literary experience. That he would get sidetracked by the comic book as a medium, and then not engage with your Dickens or your Tolstoy or whatever else he wanted him to be reading at that age. And I find that fascinating, because that, I think, speaks to a sense, it's this recurring generational story we have. That the young have no respect for the old, they're not listening, they're turning away from their betters, they're turning away from their fathers, their teachers, and they're discovering something else. So there's that same fear, but the wonderful postscript is where the kid actually writes to Wortham. I think that's beautiful.
A really nice letter.
Really lovely answer. I'm
smart kid.
I'm going to read it out.
Okay.
Dear Dr. Wortham, thank you very much for your letter. So the article's been published. Wortham's responded. Thank you very much for your letter. I've read my father's article, and I think it is very good. I don't agree with all the things in it. I don't think comics do much harm to children. I don't think they're all good, though. Most children learn enough to know if a comic is sensible. Only a few would take an unlikely story seriously. I don't take them seriously, but I enjoy some of them. Thank you again for your letter. Best wishes, Paul Warshaw. And then the kicker. P.S. I would very much like to meet you. I feel, Kumar, here's an idea. A pitch for anyone out there listening, right? This one's for free. When Wortham Met Warshaw. Comic about Frederick Wortham with all his, held to ideas, fixed ideas, the danger implicit in the comic book, meets this 11-year-old. And they have a a little My Dinner with Andre debate about the comic book. There you go.
You know what? It would only work if you know what? It would work as an EC comic where he belittles the kid until the kid runs crying up to his bedroom, and then Wortham's mother shows up and says, "Don't you remember those comics you read when you were a kid?" And then we learn about all of the horror and crime comics that Wortham read as a child, and then he hangs his head in shame as all his colleagues berate, ostracize him for having read these crime comics as a child.
I like that. Okay. Yeah, that's an idea. But I really love that. I really love that detail. And I love how she's taken this focus to EC Comics.
Yeah.
And, it's not about coming on one side of the argument or other, whether these were revolutionary or whether these were actually...
No, it's very nuanced.
It's very... Yeah, exactly. And again, her focus on these individual stories and on the issue of race and on the successes and failures of the approach of these, nominally white creators, how they actually treated of race and tried to engage this audience. She does an excellent job. I mean, and that's for the benefit of the listener, Kumar lent me this, and I really enjoyed reading this. I turned this over in an evening.
Yeah,
it's a very easy read.
Coming up, Whitted's somewhat surprising takes on Judgment Day and some other classic EC stories. But first, a reminder to join us for trivia quizzes, reviews of The Amazing Spider-Man by Lee and Ditko, and more. Check out our goals and rewards at patreon.com/deconcomics. If you'd rather give a one-time donation, you can do so via PayPal by sending it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to the Superman Fan Podcast. My name is Billy Hogan, and I will be your host. Before we begin our journey through the time barrier, please ensure that your red indestructible capes are securely fastened around your necks so that we may all travel safely into the past to explore the Silver Age adventures of the Man of Steel in the pages of Action Comics, Superman, Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane, and World's Finest Comics. After we return from our journey, I encourage you to go to the website, thesupermanfanpodcast.blogspot.com. I look forward to have you join me each week to explore the Silver Age adventures of the Man of Steel.
Her take on Judgment Day is... She had a take on it I'd never thought about, which really... She makes a really damning statement about it, which is that basically... Darlton, the astronaut from Earth who judges this race of robots, basically comes in as a colonialist and speaks to them that way. And it's like, oh yeah, I never even thought about it. It's one of those things that I never even realized that. But at the end of it, she's like, kind of like, this is a great story. Like, despite this massive kind of elephant in the room, if you will, that you can... There's a subtextual elephant in the room. At the end of it, she's like, this is really a watershed moment, this story.
Yeah, and she also relates it to the Bradbury Martian story, doesn't she?
Yes, that's right, yeah.
Where the survivor of white violence who escaped to Mars with his family, and then the white settlers arrive having destroyed the Earth, and he has this opportunity to, do to them what they did to him and his ancestors and his family, his parents, and he chooses a future together. Now, I find that interesting, but I think judgment here is offered with the hopeful, like the astronaut does say friend to the robot. He addresses him as friend.
Right.
And he's saying, you still have the chance. You can still turn things around.
Right.
And, enter this galactic community, but you just need to address these issues. So So it's interesting. But I just found that, was it that Bradbury... I can't recall the timings. Was it that Bradbury was inspired by this?
No, Bradbury's first, I think.
Bradbury's first? Okay.
In fact, she points out a lot of the stories are almost like lifted almost from old movies and stuff, or, they were slightly earlier.
Which, again, is not unusual at the time, because they're pumping out all these stories as you clip. And, with superhero comics, you can often draw back characters to individual actors' performances or characters that played in certain movies, the famous example of the Joker and the Man Who Laughed, and then I think the Wasp owes something to a Bee Lady movie.
Right.
There's things like that you can trace back. But I think what's interesting here, what saves this, is again the illustrative quality.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And that while the morals are maybe unsubtle, they are done with a deliberate approach.
Yeah.
It's not the Wayans brother shouting message. It's actually like it's woven into the narrative voice. There is a sense of somebody just having a conversation with you.
Right.
Which isn't as sledgehammer as I think people have assumed.
Right.
And Feldstein love of puns and everything. That's a whole thing.
This is, Judgment Day is 15 years before Star Trek. And I don't remember what year Forbidden Planet came out, but that was like a crew of all white men.
Yes.
So, I don't know. I do feel like some of these stories are ahead of their time. I think I do wonder what would have happened if Feldstein had tried to write voices for black characters more than the few lines he did, and what if he had stumbled? It might have been worse. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's a very thin line there. But again, like I said at the very top, he doesn't give the Jewish characters any voices either. Even in Master Race, the Jewish characters hardly speak. Yeah, I wonder if also she didn't really talk about rereading Judgment Day, because she talks about how you look back at the story once you realize in the final panel that the astronaut has been a black character the whole time. But when you've read it 3, 4, 10 times, like I have, I think it's a different experience. Because there's no shock. It's more like you're more judgmental of the robots from the first panel, maybe?
Yeah. Yeah. I find, talking about creators ripping off cinema or theatrical performances or anything like that, when Judgment Day is concerned, I always think of the Teen Titans issue 26
okay.
of Teen Titans, which is where the Titans have decided they're not going to wear the costumes anymore. They've been approached by this billionaire benefactor named, I think his name is Mr. Jupiter.
Okay.
I think it's Lauren Jupiter. And he's going to bankroll them to work for social justice causes.
Okay.
This is published in 1970.
Okay.
Because superheroes are just part of the problem. You need to actually be young people and get involved in youth movements and try and change social values. Believe it or not, this is actually a very conservative take on youth culture and youth movements and all the rest of it. It was written by Robert Kanigher and Nick Cardy was the artist. But in that issue 26, titled "A Penny for a Black Star,"
okay,
which, unfortunate name.
Yeah.
A character called Mal, who I've always had a soft spot for. I think he's a really interesting character. He takes on the challenge of getting to a space shuttle, experimental rocket, and taking off. It was an unmanned flight, but he has to prove himself because he's interacting with all these former superheroes, and he feels outclassed by them. So this is what he does.
Okay.
And the final moment of the comic is him basically rocketing off in space to a fate unknown, and chances are he's going to die. And I've often wondered if Robert Kanigher was ripping off Judgment Day.
Oh.
Because it's almost the same last panel.
Wow. Okay. Right.
Whereas the black astronaut, he's not meant to be there. He's not meant to be flying the shuttle and all this sort. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, it's
the kind of thing that's I think I've said it before somewhere else, and maybe I'm talking to my ass, but like that's always been my theory.
Right. that leads me to think of something else, which is Warren's war comics. So Warren, when they popped up in the late 60s or early 70s, somewhere in there, were basically like EC comics done by people who had grown up reading EC comics and were adults. So everything was ramped up to 11. There was like Warren's horror comics had like more sex, more violence. And their war comic, the one short-lived, I think the only one, was very short-lived, Blazing Combat, 4 issues. I kind of wish I could see Whitted's thoughts about Blazing Combat, because there they do similar kind of social protest comics. And there's one that pops to mind where it's Vietnam, no longer Korean War is the focus of Vietnam, where there's a soldier, a black medic soldier, and there's a super racist guy in the unit, and he doesn't want to be treated by this guy, or he doesn't want to have anything to do with him, but when he gets injured, the medic treats him. And then one of the other guys in the unit is like, why did you bother treating him? Because he hates you, and he hates black people, and what is the point? The guy's worthless. And he's like, this is what I do. I would save him no matter what. And actually, it's everything. It's almost everything that was done. All of the flaws in EC are kind of fixed in Warren in this respect, in that he has a voice. And, I mean, they use the N-word and stuff in Warren. It's like, it's much more advanced, if you know what I mean. So I I was kind of wishing, if I had gotten to an interview, I certainly would have asked her if she'd read any of the Warren, the Blazing Combat stuff, because it really just seems to be like, oh, we love what EC was doing and how they tried to be progressive, and we're going to do that. But again, it was still written by white writers, I believe, most of that stuff, but they were definitely it was the next step up. I feel like EC was the baby steps, and this was kind of the juvenile steps.
Yeah. And I did have to wonder as well, when they were talking about some of the war stories and the depictions of, let's say, frustrated responses to the realities of war. I mean, they don't get down and dirty into it, but there is still a sense of, like when is it Joey comes back in Gratitude, and comes back, and the town Centerville are celebrating him, and then he has to hit them upside the head with some facts about what it's like over there, and how he thought he was fighting for one thing, and now he's come back home and he's discovered that that potentially wasn't real. I do wonder all the influence of war comics on a young Garth Ennis as well.
Oh, yeah.
And which obviously he's talked about at length, and he, I think, principally was reading lots of British, UK war comics.
Yeah.
But I do wonder if there was a knock-on influence from some of the work EC were doing, where it wasn't all, adventure garbage.
Yes. Well, I mean, so the war comic, especially Frontline Combat, was very special because Kurtzman was the boss. And he was something else. Like, his mind was in another realm. The war comics he talks about are really a lot better than I don't want to say a lot better. They're of a different. They're not sensationalist like the shock suspense stories, which is literally, the title is shock suspense stories. You know what you're going to get. I only had 2 points left in my notes.
Go for it.
Okay. One is there's a story in Frontline Combat. There was in World War II. There was a combat unit that was made entirely of Japanese Americans.
Right.
And it's a really amazing story. I think as far as my recollection is, it's only those characters. So they're the only ones that speak in the whole story. And it's really pretty. I love that one. And she didn't mention it, which I thought I just kind of scratched my head. Like, that would have been an interesting one to, just at least make a footnote about or something.
Okay, yeah.
And the other point she says, which is, I think, an overarching thing, is that she talks about how the stories were about undermining authority figures, and undermining all the message stories were about undermining the status quo, if you will, post-World War II status quo. But my only note about that was actually Mad is also the same thing. That I think it fits right in there, because all those movie parodies are like, don't trust what Hollywood or what society's telling you is a good movie. It's actually got all these junky things about it. So I think that was part of the whole EC Comics ethos. And that was just a random note I had. It's not a particularly good note to end the discussion on or anything like that. But did you want to say anything else, or did you have any other notes? Or
there was a passage I would like to discuss with you.
Sure.
It relates to Blood Brothers.
Okay.
And she's sort of rounding off the discussion on that story. And as you said, the ending where his comeuppance is basically, individual shame.
Yeah.
So she's talking about Sid's bowed head, slumped shoulders, and tears. And the idea of shame, the depiction of shame, is something that's common to EC as a concluding panel, or a conclusion of a story. Visually undermining the authority of white people who espouse racist attitudes. Okay, these reactive gestures broadcast the shame effect as the body's defenses are broken down, visually undermining the authority of white people who espouse racist attitudes. Mm-hmm. And she goes on, this is where I started asking questions.
Okay.
The scholar Karen Kukkonen, in her cognitive analysis of the comics form, emphasizes how the actions we see on the page, quote, relate to our own bodily experience of the world, end quote.
Yeah.
The connection between our physical, quote, body schema, end quote, and the activity being represented can impact how we understand what is happening in the story and how we interpret the power dynamics between characters. She explains, quote, when we see characters do something in a panel, the processes in our brain unfold something like an imitation of those postures in motor sensory systems which prepare the action but do not lead us to actually perform it.
Okay.
And we feel an echo of the character's experience, end quote. And she goes on. So she's talking about the visual depiction of shame.
Yeah. And
how this relates to the preachies, this idea of the strong coercive tug at the heart of the preachies, she says. So yeah. I think that applies, specifically that applies to the realistic art style, particularly Wally Wood's style.
Yeah. Well, the art has to be good enough, right?
It has to represent recognizable physical motions.
Yes.
And I wonder how that applies to artistic styles which aren't making an attempt at bodily realism.
Great point.
This Karen Kukkonen and her research, I'm just wondering how broad the research is. Is it applicable? Or when we talk about those other approaches in art style, and this is just for the benefit of anyone listening, I am not having to go at Whitted or Kukkonen or anyone else, but I'm just trying to understand the point being made.
Yeah.
Because I would have said that there are many artistic interpretations of a script that could visualize shame, or shame could become an actual entity on the panel, something Morrison's talked about. You could have a concept of shame rendered through color. You could have a concept of shame rendered through the use of sound as well, like this sense of being surrounded by sensation. And does that change then this motor sensory reaction on our part? Because when we look at the panel, we're not necessarily recognizing what we're seeing, but we're interpreting what we're seeing. So I was a little tripped up by that, because I think there's many different ways to skin a cat, and there's many different ways to illustrate a comic book panel, and I just wondered what that was getting at. There's every chance I'm being very unfair here, that the point is comprehensible, and I'm just making a mountain of a molehill. But it tripped me up, and it's one of the pages, because the majority of the time I was reading this book, I was like, yes, that's great, yes, good, yes. And I got to this page, I was like, I don't understand.
Well, I would say that actually, so again, because this is an academic book, there is not usually when she's quoting other people, sometimes it's hard to parse. It's never her own writing, which is very lucid. But sometimes when she quotes from other academics or scholars, it was hard for my head. And I did an MA. I lived in this world, and and as I did struggle with the last academic book we covered, the other 80s, sometimes the writing was a little bit hard to get through. But I know that's not your point. I know what you mean, but it's kind of, when you started making that point, I was like, well, yeah, EC had the 10 best artists in the business at the same time. So it was never going to go wrong for them, or there was never going to be a more abstract way of representing shame on the page than a really amazing drawing of somebody with slumped shoulders by Wally Wood or Jack Kamen or Bernie Krigstein or Kurtzman or anybody that was in the stable at that time.
Or even your experience of manga, where you have the little signifiers of shame.
Yeah.
Which a Western reader wouldn't necessarily pick up.
That's a great point. Like that giant sweat mark or the X on the forehead, that means they're stressed out. And a Japanese reader is like, maybe would feel that stress response in their head from seeing that X on the forehead, and another reader in another country is not going to get that at all. Yeah. So that's a field of studies. It sounds like. And I think also, how does that relate to like movies, when you see somebody's face projected 10 feet tall on a screen and see the emotions of a good actor versus a bad actor and all that? Yeah, this is a whole other question. A whole other book, maybe.
Well, far be it from us
to
try and nail down this book with our tired criticisms. This is, after all, the 2020 Eisner Award winner for Best Academic Scholarly Work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which we haven't mentioned. I think
no, I don't know if I even knew that. Maybe I did. But anyway, I really love that I did not feel the shame of an EC Comics character reading it for my love of EC Comics. I was really worried that I was going to feel Feldstein shame, and I did not. And as I said before, I think it's really balanced. It's very well written, and it's brief. It's not super long. It's like 150 pages of the main text.
But it's also succinct.
Yes, well. Yeah. But I think if you haven't done any academic reading, much like the other 80s, there might be some parts that are like a bit obscure, I guess is the word. But otherwise, I loved it. I really did.
Yeah, and again, for the record, Kumar, thank you so much for giving me this book. I really had a good time reading it. Great. I was very much looking forward to this conversation on the back of it, because I was like, this is great. People should be reading this book. It's a fantastic read. And I liked seeing some of the names in the preface. I like all these people. These are all good people. Yeah. I like this book.
Yeah. Very cool. Okay.
EC Comics, Race, Shock, and Social Protest by Qiana Whitted is published by Rutgers University Press. You can help the Deconstructing Comics family of podcasts by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics, and go to deconstructingcomics.com to connect to us on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, to shop on Amazon to support the show, and to find links to subscribe to the podcast. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and we'll critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. Next week, a badass kid superhero takes on tough gangs and corrupt police. Ryan Cecil Smith joins me to discuss Ben Sears' graphic novel, Young Shadow. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.